everyone. Very good morning. Welcome to the second day of the API Days Dubai. Today we have some of the exciting topics on the API first strategy. And without further ado, let me introduce to the Ian. He's the senior developer advocate at the Postman, and he's going to talk about the how API first world look like for the non-developers. Hey Ian, welcome to the stage.
Hi, Shreya. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, really excited for your talk.
Awesome. Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ian Douglas. I'm a senior developer advocate at Postman. I've been in the tech industry for over 26 years, mostly in backend development, and I've spent a large portion of the past decade focusing on developer advocacy and education. Today, I'd like to share some thoughts on API first development, why it's important to have non-developers included in the process, and how we can get their help in building and testing the user experience as part of the API first workflow. My Twitter handle is at the bottom of each slide, and I welcome comments and feedback, both public and private, as you feel comfortable. So let's start with a quick introduction to API first so that you can see my perspective as it relates to the API lifecycle that we see in the diagram. API first is a way to think about your API design very thoroughly before you implement anything at all in software or architecture. It will involve several people within your organization to carefully examine your business goals, define what the scope of your API will do, and design the work thoroughly. From there, your team can build documentation and use mock servers to test full workflows to make sure that the user experience matches those initial business goals. With an API first mindset, it's important that your organization does all of this in a small feedback loop, and only once these goals are met should the architecture planning and development begin. But the question today is, how do we get more non-developers into this process, and why is that important? If we highlight the first few areas of API first development, we see that the definition, design, documentation, and test phases are areas where development skills aren't as necessary. You can design a workflow pattern without understanding how it gets implemented in software. People can be part of this effort without understanding scalability and security best practices. If you do know these things, then of course that's better, but they aren't strictly necessary at this stage. It's also important to note that the API first mindset encompasses the entire API lifecycle, not only the 4 areas that I've left on this slide, but these 4 areas are where we're going to focus our attention today. Having non-developers on the team can give new input and ideas about who might use our software or applications. This doesn't mean that we need to design our APIs and applications strictly for non-developers, but we need to remember that not everyone who uses our software comes from the same education and background that we do as developers. Secondly, it's very easy to lose sight of how to build an API which feels easy to use for people who aren't as experienced as us when we're working with it and building it every day. We know how it's made, so it will be easier for us. It'll feel obvious to us how to use the software and all the little gotchas. We don't want to have to explain every facet of our application. It should feel simple and intuitive. Sometimes as engineers, we lose sight of this. We are the first users of our software, but we're not the final users of our software. Having non-developers examine the user workflows can be vital visibility into things that we might overlook. Finally, having non-developers on the team can help raise ideas and arguments to move away from existing systems and start something new. This doesn't mean that you need to reinvent every component in your system architecture, but it should allow for the freedom to try things that you haven't done before. So what can this look like in practice, though? Well, what if your business goal is to build something like this highly technical sports car made up of everybody's favorite plastic bricks? Stick with me through the analogy. It's going to take a minute to explain what I mean. Your non-developers want to help on the design, and they have great ideas. And everyone in the organization can clearly see the value in producing something like this. But how do we get them involved in helping to shape such an elaborate outcome? Well, what we don't want to do is walk them through step by step what to do, what to build, how to build, why to build, all in a particular way. That would take an enormous amount of time. And in the process, we might end up losing out on their perspectives and viewpoints when we try to confine them to what we believe is possible. We need to give them the freedom to design on their own. They already know what they want the final outcome to be. So maybe all we need to teach them about are the kinds of pieces that they have to work with. So imagine for a moment that all we had to do was show them an inventory of what we have, or what we as a team are capable of making, and letting their creativity help the process. If we gave them an inventory sheet that looks like this, then they could come back and say, I get something like this piece, but with a slight change. And then what if they went off and explored the combination of pieces to make a bumper, or a seat, or a steering wheel? Imagine where that could lead. Now, of course, you don't want to overwhelm them completely with too many options either. There needs to be a balance of giving them the information that they need, but giving them the freedom to explore their curiosity too. And this does, of course, take time. Nobody is suggesting this process will speed things up during this design stage. In fact, when properly followed, taking a typical API first approach can slow down your initial release times. But with the correct planning and definitions of what you want to build, future iterations will become faster and faster. In the long run, it's worth it. And in the meantime, your whole team feels valued because they were included in the process. Their voices and perspectives were heard, and they feel like they contributed to the success. So imagine then that your development team helps them by building the smaller components that they need and then letting them continue with their design work to help plan the possibilities, to refine their ideas, to document things, and then to test out that user experience. You might be curious at this point where I'm going with the analogy of the plastic blocks and exploring how they can be used to build something incredible. Well, our company introduced Flows as part of the Postman product in September of 2021. Flows is a visual programming tool that allows you to make API requests and chain the result onto a whole workflow of branch logic, loops, and control structures. The idea of durable or sticky variable types and working with multiple environments to create some really great sequences of work. The team has been working hard to iterate on a regular basis to improve the user experience and to increase the simplicity of its use. There's a link on the bottom of this slide that will be present for the next several slides. Within the Postman application, you may already be familiar with the idea of forking collections of requests into your workspaces. Well, now you can also fork flows into your own workspace in Postman as well. And the link here will take you to several examples that you can check out, including the one on the next slide. So here's a screenshot of flows and how someone can chain together two API requests to complete an authentication sequence, grab some data like an access token, and then pass that data onto more requests and potentially see an outcome at the end. If you're curious how all of these work together, I encourage you to follow the link at the bottom of the slide. I'm going to paste it in chat for you here as well. And I encourage you to fork these flows into your own workspace and try them out. When many people see this, they think that Flows is a no-code solution since it's a visual tool. We do call it a visual programming tool, and so we want to be clear that Flows is more of a low-code solution since you still need to understand things like if-else branch logic, loop conditions, and so on. But each of these blocks, just like those little plastic bricks, has the potential to become something really neat. For the non-developers on your team, all they need for you is to build them the blocks, and then let them explore how these blocks can be used to make a larger project. In fact, if you're not a developer yourself, you can use flows to make all kinds of interesting projects of mixing other APIs together, like planning a road trip, determining how long it'll take to arrive, and see what the weather is going to be like at the location at the time that you get there. To be clear, though, Flows does not generate code, but it will allow non-developers on your team, with a little bit of training, to design the user workflow of the end goal of what you want your API to be, how users should interact with it, and what their overall experience should be. If your development teams can build these blocks and build some flows, then your non-developers can fork them into their own workspaces and explore how things fit together, to understand at a visual level how the API should work, to better support the definition and design of the API that your team is going to build. From here, they can provide excellent feedback, which will help iterate on the definition and design and so on until the team feels it's ready to start development. This is the very nature of getting started with the API first mindset. So let's take a look at some of the blocks and what they do. The first block that we're going to explore here are the tasks that actually do something. The most important one here is the block that will send an API request. You'll use these the most inside of Flows. The API requests that get called in these blocks have to be made in a Postman collection already, and they can include pre-request scripts and test scripts, which will execute when the block is activated in Flows. Each block can use a different environment, so you could combine requests from different collections in a single workflow where maybe those different collections need different Postman environment settings. Now, I do specify on the slide here that the pre-request and test scripts will execute for a collection request with a few exceptions. There are a few Postman-specific API calls that don't work within flows, such as telling your script to set a next request for the Postman collection runner. You can leave that code in there, you can leave the code in there if you want to use the collection runner or Newman if you're familiar with those tools, but those calls will be ignored by flows. The second kind of task block is called a delay. I don't have a slide explaining an example of that because it does exactly what the name suggests and introduces a delay. This could be helpful for waiting on an API endpoint to finish processing some data in the background. For example, you could make an API call that you know is going to take some time to process. You can wait in a loop by setting a delay and loop a couple of times and check on the process to see when it's finished. The next block types are our data values, which can be used as input to requests or within our loops. These can be beneficial if you need to pass in a username or a date to a block as an input, but you can also use them to extract data from requests as well. The data types that you use will also have effects on the remaining blocks that we'll discuss next. For example, if you choose a string data type, you'll have access to methods to manipulate the string. So we're going to take a look at those next. We have more blocks listed on this slide, but this is not an exhaustive list of everything that you can build as a block in Flows. We have lots of controls for loops and branch logic, and lots of operations for numeric and string manipulation, even list searching and uniqueness checks. You can also do checks like any and all values within a list and more. I really encourage everyone to check out the example flows link on these slides that I also pasted in chat, where you can see some working examples of flows and how these blocks can work together. And last but not least, everybody's debugging friend, we have a terminal block, which is a console log, but the logging in these blocks allows you to isolate console output from blocks into collected channels that we call groups. So you can group output into one of several channels. For example, maybe I want my own debugging to go to a particular group with my name. Or maybe you want all of your authentication endpoints to be logged to the same place and not have to worry about all of your output being mixed together in one place to sort through later. The link that I've had on the bottom of the slides will take you to a workspace in Postman where you can use flows that we've already set up for you. There's a lot of documentation in there as well on how to chain them together and use them. Imagine if your team built several workflows for how to handle authentication, get an access token, and pass that ahead to another request. That problem is now solved and it's tested for your team. Your non-developers don't have to puzzle that out for themselves any longer. They can literally copy that set of blocks into a new workflow and continue working from there. Maybe your team could build some blocks that parse some HTML to extract a known piece of information, maybe base 64 encoded if you need, and save that in a new string. Great. Your team can copy that set of blocks into a flow as well. The idea here is the illustration I gave before with the plastic building blocks. By knowing an inventory of the kinds of requests that your API could make, or the kinds of blocks that your team can generate, and having some starting workflows already built by your team, your non-developers can plug these sets of blocks into larger workflows to test an entire end-to-end user experience. Non-developers who use your sets of blocks don't have to necessarily understand what each block is doing, or they don't have to go read the actual JavaScript code that you add into a pre-request or a test script for an API call. They just need to know there's a block that they can use to fetch an access token. And now they have that access token available for other things they want to work on. So, what does this look like in a practical sense? When we think about the whole API lifecycle, the goal here is to allow them to craft the user experience and to use their findings to make a better API for everyone. In the context of API first thinking, the design and definition of the API using a tool like Flows to plan the user experience makes a lot of sense to get an unbiased view of a user's workflow and using that smaller feedback loop to iterate on direction. As the design is finalized, the rest of the team can then move on to the development of the product. Of course, there's a little bit of support that needs to be given to non-developers to include them in this process. So let's talk about that next. The development teams will have some initial work to do in order to support the non-developers, but should require little maintenance or training afterwards. To get started, the team will need to create collections of requests. The blocks and flows will need these requests in order to be effective. If you want your team to actually execute the flows to see them in operation, you'll need to create mock servers out of your collection requests. I ran a workshop yesterday on how to build mock servers when you don't even have an API of your own yet. I encourage you to check that out as well, but you can contact me as well if you need help on that. Secondly, the non-developers on your team will need some amount of guidance on basic data types, but chances are pretty good they already have an understanding and some notion of things like if-else branch logic and the idea of iterating over a loop to do the same task, like while there are chores to do one chore, and so on. Finally, this will take time. And while that feels like the one thing none of us have enough of, it's important not to rush the team, or they can easily feel overwhelmed or frustrated at the process. Their input and perspectives will be needed on your team, so it's important to be patient with them. This is especially important because using a mock server won't be flexible enough to return dynamic data, but only send back static responses. So your team will need to know the limitations of these examples to build out these user experience workflows within Postman. By having mock servers set up, your non-developers can make API calls and flows, and your teams can start writing behavior-driven tests in Postman to ensure that everything works as expected within the confines of what our mock servers allow you to build. Currently, Postman supports mock servers for REST APIs and GraphQL, and we're working on adding support for gRPC and others in the future. Ultimately, it would be nice to get to a point where even non-developers have a drag and play kind of interface, which is intuitive and easy enough for them to use and understand without needing too much additional support. With the right tools, this can be a much easier process, and we're certainly working hard on this ourselves at Postman. But like those little plastic bricks, they need to be built before the fancy car model can be made. There are lots of no-code and low-code solutions out there, but they're all going to require some amount of training and understanding to use effectively. And if your teams are already using Postman, then Flows is a great visual programming tool to allow your teams to collaborate on their work in a single environment. So I encourage you to check out the flows in Postman to see how it can help out your team with that API first planning of your user experience. It's a fantastic tool that is much easier than writing JavaScript code by hand. Spend some time with it and try to imagine how building some blocks and workflows could be beneficial to your team and how easily non-developers could use flows as well. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you'd like to have some conversation about API first or about developer advocacy or about using flows on Postman. Thanks for the opportunity to share my thoughts today.
Hey, Ian, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing everything about the API first strategy. It
Thank you.
was really nice to get the idea on how Postman Flow works. And yeah, so we do have a couple of questions from the audience. And the very first question is that how to be prepared or get ready for the API's first strategy and how encourage team to, get involved, because like people knows about the API first strategy, but it's really hard for them to encourage team to contribute to the same. So what's your thought on that?
That's a great question. API first is it feels tricky to get into when you already have an API or you already have something. Like, how do we become an API first company? We're actually working on some documentation within Postman, and we're going to have that released hopefully pretty soon about how you can sort of migrate your thinking into becoming an API first company. Now, if you don't have anything built yet, becoming an API first sort of project or company is much, much easier because you're already starting with a plan. If you already have an API, though, you can basically start taking on that API first mindset with the next iteration, where you're going to say, hey, we're going to stop, we're going to plan out the whole user experience of making sure everything looks and feels the same. That's kind of your governance team. And then from there, progressing into how are we going to design this? How are we going to document it? And kind of working through that API lifecycle that I showed in an earlier slide. And through that process, just being really mindful about what do we want the end user experience to be. We want all of our APIs to feel consistent. We want them all to feel intuitive. We want them to be easy to understand, and we want them well documented. They have to be well documented. That documentation has to be searchable. And as much of that as you can do as possible before you get into the development is going to be really important to make sure that that user experience matches the business goals of what you're trying to build.
Okay, okay, great. And what are some of the challenges that team could expect on API path, API first path?
Some
Your
challenges.
thoughts?
I think the first challenge is that API first is going to feel like a little bit of a slower process. It does feel a little bit like design-driven development or document-driven development because you're doing so much planning up front before you actually start building your software. At that point, though, because everything is well defined and documented, and you understand the strategy of the business goals of what you're trying to build, future iterations actually become faster over time. And so over time, it's going to speed things up by doing more of that planning up front.
Yeah, yeah, got it, got it. And how do you centralize the thoughts among the team to how to motivate them for the API first strategy? Because it's really hard for developers to like doing the design like things before the development, because they already developers always want to write a code, and it fills them a little bit of boring stuff for documentation and design. So like what's your thought on centralize the thought process as a team?
It's actually a really critical part before you start doing the development. If you
uh,
jump into the development, that has implications on how everything else needs to work and build. And also, as a developer myself, this is also my first instinct too of like, let me just go in and start building the thing.
yeah,
But when you start building it without that plan, you end up refactoring a lot, and ultimately it can take more time because you're refactoring the code later, as opposed to planning everything out properly and then building against that plan. The other thing that can happen too as a developer is you have a certain mindset of what's possible. And this is the way that we've always done it. Where when you take more of an API first approach, you're thinking about what's possible and not
yeah,
what have we always done. And by taking that more freedom around what's possible, you can sort of sever the ties and sort of decouple yourself from legacy systems and older systems of the way that we've always done it. And it gives you the freedom to then explore like what else is possible.
yeah, yeah, really, really a great point for what's possible in the
Yeah.
like it brings a great clarity between the team as well for the API first strategy. Yeah. Okay, Ian, thank you very much for the
Thank you.
wonderful talk. Yeah.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.